Japanese society had adapted strangely to its rapid industrialization. A strong collectivism pervaded the culture, and the concept of the salaryman was normalized, where a working man would work at a single company for all of his life. Companies became almost like families, and those within a company would watch out for one another and spend much of their time together both on and off the clock. Sick days were often left on the table out of a sense of duty. For the first generations of boys growing up in this new industrialized Japan, the prospect of getting a salaried job was paramount to serving a productive life and was seen as the best way to preserve one's honor. The traditional way into a salaried position was simple: work hard in school, get good grades, be active in clubs, and you'd be funneled into a salaried job. Somewhere in the process, marriage was expected to occur. But school was brutal and stressful. Colleges were highly competitive, and since the quality of one's job directly corresponded to their grades and their honor, getting into the right college was a perpetual pressure. For some, this pressure was too much, and they felt that they had no way of combating their lot. Clubs in Japanese schools typically revolved around sports, but for these social misfits, sports often failed to hold their interest. This didn't change the fact that schools mandated club membership. In response, these boys began creating their own clubs in schools, which they dubbed culture clubs. Keiichiro Morikawa, in his essay Otaku, describes the formation of these clubs. Quote, "The unpopular adolescent, bad at sports, introverted, fat, or of delicate constitution, can be found in just about every school around the world. However, the structure provided by clubs that systematically encourage unpopular students to pursue interests other than sports is unique to Japan. Otaku may be found throughout the world, but in Japan, otaku are strongly associated with specific fields of interest. School culture in Japan has played an enormous role in nurturing an otaku culture. In particular, clubs devoted to the study of manga, sci-fi, or computers, as well as art and literature clubs, are frequently transformed into dens of otaku." With unpopular students outwardly showing an obsession with manga and anime in particular, the majority of youth who had once enjoyed these styles halted their consumption, seeing it as a medium that only nerds enjoyed. Over the course of just a few years, the majority of the market for anime had become this niche male nerd culture. Morikawa goes on to state the belief that Gundam may have been the anime that had the most influence over this transfer of popularity, as the main character was a socially awkward boy who learns to pilot a gigantic robot and thus earn reputation and honor. The wanton spending by these hyper-focused nerds turned out to be a large revenue stream, and the anime and manga markets began shifting to accommodate the tastes of these young people. Over the course of the 80s, new subgenres of anime and manga were created, each one designed to appeal to a different kind of fan. The number of subgenres is vast and spans the traditional definitions of comedy, drama, horror, and the like, but there is also a massive list of other genres that scarcely exist in any other form of media. Some of the most notable are shonen and shoujo, which had maintained popularity even into the 80s, but these were joined by genres with entirely new tropes invented for anime and manga, such as harem for many women interested in one man, slice of life which exaggerates everyday circumstances, and ecchi for non-explicit sexual material. These genres would often be combined with one another to create strange and interesting new shows. Though this audience was predominantly male, there was still a large female audience that carried over from the shoujo manga, and so dramas with female focus were created as well, often about women in a variety of romantic situations. In a sense, anime was updating itself to fit in with postmodernism, an artistic movement that was coming to dominate artistic scenes all over the world at the time. Hiroki Azuma, a Japanese critic focusing on otaku culture, describes this shift in anime in his seminal work, Otaku, Japan's Database Animals. Here, he explains the way that postmodernism has mutated the way that we understand narratives. Before this shift, most popular narratives would examine the same cultural narrative through a variety of different lenses. For example, Mighty Atom and Gojira were both ways of understanding the horrifying nature of the nuclear bombs and the trauma of war suffered by Japan. More recently, he explains, instead of there being a unifying central narrative, there is a database of elements from which works draw. The anime Cowboy Bebop, for example, takes from science fiction, Wild West, and noir elements, each with their own tropes. This method of crafting narratives proved to be appealing to the otaku, since this new culture was comprised of many different kinds of nerds who each enjoyed their own niche interest. With these changes in the market, otaku began consuming ever more and more anime and manga over the 80s. Though a person classified as otaku may not have had anime and manga as a specific interest, the two had become inseparable. Even as anime was becoming a niche market in Japan, it was attracting a more widespread audience overseas. While television shows remained the most popular distribution method for anime, America was opening up to the idea of anime movies, a popularity led by one director in particular, Hayao Miyazaki. In 1984, he directed the film Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, which was received extremely positively in Japan and prompted him to found his own animation studio, which he named Studio Ghibli, where he continued to produce well-reviewed and high-grossing anime films. Producers in America began clamoring to dub these movies from Japanese to English and distribute them. Though it was relatively rare for foreign films to appear in American theaters, Studio Ghibli's works became a common sight, and they continued to release films in the 80s to excited audiences taken by this foreign animation style. Other anime shows and movies were gaining cult followings in America as well, with films such as the critically acclaimed Akira. Even so, animation in America was seen as a children's medium, so while some accepted it, others brushed it off. This can especially be seen in the original localization for Nausicaa, where much of the story and complicated subject matter was removed for the sake of marketing towards a younger audience.
1,000 years from now, the time for hope is running out as the forces of evil are everywhere.
Back in Japan, the same process that had created the otaku had also created an even more extreme group of people. Young men especially had been targeted by the older generation of salarymen for decades as the cause of social degradation, chiding them for not following in their footsteps and becoming salarymen themselves. What many of these men didn't understand was that, in Japan, the economic situation was changing, and obtaining a salaried position had become extremely difficult and rare. Those who jumped from job to job were seen as not having real work, no better than being unemployed and, therefore, a drain on society. On top of this, Japan was on the brink of an economic recession. Japanese banks had been giving out more and more risky loans which went unrepaid, and eventually, when Japan's central bank attempted to cover up the issue, it caused the debt bubble to burst in the beginning of the 90s, destroying the old, consistent Japanese style of management for those new entrants to the workforce. The culture seemed unable to accommodate these young men, and the ones who faced the brunt of the criticism were often the eldest boys who had the most demands placed upon them by their parents. More and more young men caved under this heavy societal pressure, and for some, it became so great that they felt paralyzed and stopped leaving the home for any reason. In Japan, it's common for young people to live with their parents for extended periods. Often, women won't leave until they marry, and men sometimes never leave at all. This phenomenon was different, however. Rather than searching for work, these young men would often simply indulge in media all day. Despite this sedentary behavior, Japanese parents usually wouldn't even consider kicking their children out of their house, and so these boys lived there, unable or refusing to move. There is a term in the West for these young men, an acronym spelled NEET, or NEET, meaning not in education, employment, or training. These young men in Japan, however, were given a new name, Hikikomori. The lives of these Hikikomori were characterized by a powerful hopelessness and depression. Though these young men, and occasionally women, were not the chief consumers of anime, they were a significant source of income for producers, and so they were targeted more and more by the industry. These changes in tone and subject matter were appreciated by more than just the Hikikomori. Many young men and women were suffering from the intense pressure of school and the demands of the entrance exams, which dictated either a pass or a fail. To deal with this stress, these young people would often limit their social interaction, romantic or otherwise, in favor of studying, growing the number of people categorized as otaku and further increasing the target audience for anime. As the 90s dragged into the 2000s, the economic recession in Japan continued, and so too did the dismantling of the salaryman ideal, unable to keep up with the globalized economy which demanded mobility. Even so, the social expectation to become a salaryman didn't diminish, and more young men felt the ire of their elders. In turn, the pressure in school became even greater, and more people were choosing to divert their attention and funds to escapism, and anime proved to be one of the most popular. Along with watching the shows, these young adults would purchase paraphernalia, increasing the financial power of the anime industry, but these fans' interest went beyond this. In Tokyo, the Akihabara district has become famous for its vast array of attractions and vendors catering to otaku culture, especially lovers of personal computers and anime. In this district, maid cafes can be found, with waitresses dressed up as maids from anime who cater to otaku. The West in the 90s and 2000s, however, saw a different audience for anime growing. Despite the adult themes of many anime movies released in America, the style was never able to distance itself and distinguish itself from child-focused Western animation to the point that many simply called them Japanese cartoons.
Ding dong, dear strongman. What would you look like as a Japanese cartoon? And what would it be about? James?
Though there were very few anime targeted directly at children, they were some of the only ones that were adapted for American audiences. Shows like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Received special attention from producers especially because of the way they fit the Western model of children's animation. Children's animation in America and the UK especially were produced at a loss, since these shows weren't created for their own sake, but instead were created to market lines of toys such as Transformers and G.I. Joe. These children's anime, similarly, were used to sell trading cards and plastic action figures. Most other anime only saw limited releases in America, if any at all, since producers didn't think it would be worth the cost to create localized versions. Despite this, a small body of people in America had developed a strong interest in anime, in some cases as strong as the otaku in Japan, and their fanaticism would find a home on the World Wide Web, which had only recently become widely available. Some enterprising anime-loving multilinguists would create what are known as fan subs, where a single person or small team of people would perform translation work themselves, providing subtitles for shows and releasing the videos online through a video streaming service, a download, or a torrent for free. Though this practice was illegal for the most part, suing Westerners internationally would be difficult, expensive, and time-consuming, and so the most that would happen was a cease and desist notice to the translators, if they could be located at all. Since most of these people online used pseudonyms and remained anonymous, these letters would often go to whoever was hosting the content. Still, once these video files were on the internet, they were nearly impossible to remove, and so these videos would be passed around online in web circles, re-uploaded in so many places that not all of them could be discovered and removed. These anime-starved Westerners, relying on one another for more anime, would congeal in online forums and chat rooms, where they could share and discuss the shows they watched, creating cult followings for this style of animation. Since so little merchandise was available outside of Japan, the fans would create their own merchandise and content. Videos known as anime music videos, or AMVs, were especially popular. The formula for these videos was simple. Take clips from an anime show and chop up the shots so that they fit with the music. With the popularity of anime nurtured by these small online communities, they began organizing larger events, which they called anime conventions, where large numbers of people would gather to discuss shows and meet with other like-minded individuals. Though these conventions had begun in the 80s, they were typically smaller affairs with less than 1,000 people attending. By the year 2000, it was common to see thousands of people congregating at the many different conventions all over America and Europe, sometimes with industry professionals attending as well. All of this attention on anime showed producers that there was, indeed, a market for their work in the West, and more shows were given official localizations. Though it was still considered a nerdy and unpopular interest, that didn't dissuade its large cult following. In Japan, the rise of otaku culture had coincided with a rise in the number of hikikomori. Though the parents of these shut-ins were often reticent to admit their situation, it became a phenomenon impossible to hide, and the Japanese government set out to determine just how widespread it had become. The results were unexpected and alarming. According to an official census in 2010, over 700,000 citizens were categorized as hikikomori, which was defined as someone who had largely not left their house for 6 months or longer and had few, if any, social connections, among other more minute points. Some psychologists believed this figure to be greater than 1 million. Startlingly, the average age of hikikomori in the study was 31. The state began instituting programs to reintegrate these people back into society, while universities began focusing their efforts toward understanding how something so strange had come about. Yukiko Uchida and Vinay Narasakunkit, in their article The NEET and the Hikikomori Spectrum, suggest that Western individualism imposing on Japan could be a culprit. They explain that, quote, globalization has created a pressure toward increasing individualism, especially the kind that seems to be practiced in the United States. However, individualism is not necessarily the same everywhere. Increasing individualism in Japan without the strong foundations that American individualism has been built on may very well contribute to confusion for many individuals who try to become individualistic, especially if they use it as an excuse to avoid interpersonal responsibilities and obligations, or to develop interpersonal skills that will let them become attuned to their in-group members." Unquote. Despite the prevalence of hikikomori, their existence seemed not to tarnish the name of otaku, and in fact, the otaku were becoming more culturally visible, especially as their spending power increased. Most of the otaku in the 80s had been teenagers or young adults in their 20s, and as time passed, they found themselves with the money to fund their hobbies, and so many of these otaku were finding themselves in positions of power. After the end of the recession, the term otaku began to lose its negative connotation, and more people were beginning to identify themselves as otaku, similar to the way that the word nerd has lost some of its pejorative quality in America. Taro Aso, former Prime Minister of Japan, has even identified himself as an otaku, and of the otaku, the manga and anime fans are the largest group. In 2005, it was estimated that, as a whole, the otaku were worth 2 trillion yen, or almost 18 billion US dollars. At the same time, anime culture was growing and changing. During the 2000s, a name was given to the most common anime aesthetic, moe. MyAnimeList.com defines it as so, quote, "Moe is a Japanese word with no good English equivalent. In fact, even Japanese people have a hard time agreeing just what it is exactly. All we can say is this: if it makes you go doki doki and makes you want to hug it, it's probably moe." Here, doki doki is an onomatopoeia for a heart beating. The word moe is often used as an adjective. This aesthetic has come to appear commonly in Japanese media outside the context of anime, especially in advertising, and now it can be difficult to think of Japanese media without the presence of moe imagery. Japanese animation had transitioned from a popular medium to a niche market to an aesthetic inextricable from Japanese media as a whole. The 2010s, for the most part, have seen a continuation of these patterns both in Japan and in America. More kinds of shows are being produced, the viewership is increasing, and conventions are only rising in attendance, while more are being organized all the time in both Japan and abroad, while Akihabara continues to chug along. Anime still has a very strong association with nerd culture, but more and more, people on the outside are looking in and finding shows and films that they enjoy. Though the going was and still is sometimes rough for this style of animation, one thing is clear: anime is here to stay.